And welcome to Cool Springs. Today is Wednesday, July the 5th, 2023. It's the day after Independence Day. Independence Day in 1776, the people who signed the Declaration of Independence were 56 representatives from each of the colonies. And when you look at what happened to these people, many of them paid a very heavy price for being willing to pick up a pen and sign their names to the document, legally severing the ties between the colonies and King George III in England. They laid out their petition of what was wrong. They said this is the reason why. They listed all the efforts they had made to reconcile and get the king to listen to their grievances. And ultimately, they said that because the king won't listen, we will pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to defend our nation, that we are completely now separated from the government of the King of Great Britain. And of course, war was declared. And many of those people suffered being arrested, having their property confiscated or destroyed by the British troops. Some of them had to hide out in huts and caves for years. Some of them had to watch as their families were put in prison because of the fact that they had stood for liberty. One of the signers of the Declaration of Independence literally had to flee from his dying wife's bedside because word had reached them that the British troops were on the way to arrest him. And so he has to flee, and by the time he's able to return, his wife, who was dying of a disease, had already passed away. They paid a heavy price for freedom. Today, we're going to look at a hero and heroine of the Bible who is female. She's going to pay a very, very heavy price emotionally for doing the right thing. We find this story in the book of 2 Samuel in chapter 21. It's the first 14 verses, and I would really suggest to you that at some time you read this story in its entirety. I won't take the time to read the whole thing here on camera, but I'll tell you the story because it shows how sometimes people's actions or their failure to act properly not only has consequences for themselves, but for other people. Back in the days of Joshua, they were told when they went into the land, don't make any deals or treaties with these people who are in the land. You were to drive them all out. But there was one group of people, the Gibeonites, who put one over on Joshua and the leaders, the elders of Israel. They wore very ragged clothes. They made sure that the clothes were really dusty and dirty. They approached him and they pretended like they had come from a far country, a long way away. They had brought with them some stale bread to provide the illusion that they had come a great distance. And they asked to make a treaty with Joshua and the Israelites to spare them and to be allied with them. And because they were tricked into it, they agreed to it. It wasn't until sometime after they'd agreed to it that they found out that the Gibeonites were some of the Canaanites there in the land and that they had been deceived. Joshua and the leaders of Israel approached the Gibeonites again and they asked them, why did you deceive us? You lied to us. And they gave an excuse that they were afraid of being put to death. And they said, look, yes, we know we lied to you and we deceived you, but let us live and we'll be your servants, your slaves. Joshua and the children of Israel agreed to that. So the Gibeonites are still in the land. Many generations passed from the time of Joshua until the time of King Saul. Saul, when he's fighting the different people groups that are attacking Israel, gets it into his head that he wants to kill the Gibeonites because they're foreigners inside the land. But the Gibeonites have been holding up their end of the bargain to be servants and to do whatever the king of Israel tells them to do. So they should not have been put to death, but Saul had put some to death, but he didn't wipe them all out. Now Saul is dead. David's been on the throne for a while. And when we pick up in 2 Samuel chapter 21, it says that there's a famine in the land. I will read you just a few verses out of there, but the whole story is 14 verses. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David sought the presence of the Lord, and the Lord said, "It is for Saul and his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death." So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the sons of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. The sons of Israel made a covenant with them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. So they're still in the land. They're not considered part of Israel, but remember, they had agreed to be servants. And David has ascertained from the fact that, okay, we've had a famine for 3 years in a row here. Something's wrong. Why did David know that? Because in Deuteronomy, Moses had told them before they went into the land that if you obey God, these are the blessings you'll receive. But if you disobey God, these are the curses that will fall upon you. And one of those curses was a famine in the land. So because there's famine in God's land, David knows something's not right. There's some unconfessed sin that we need to deal with. And now he's been told by God's Spirit that it's because of what Saul did to the Gibeonites. And he has contacted the Gibeonites. They don't want a money payment. They don't want land or freedom or anything like that. But they do ask for retribution. Their idea of justice is Saul killed some of our people. And even though Saul himself is dead, the only thing that will satisfy us is if some of Saul's family dies. And so they asked for 7 men of the house of Saul to be given to them, to be publicly hanged, to atone for the evil that Saul had done years before. And David agrees to let them have 7 men from Saul's household. He's going to spare Jonathan, his friend's son, Mephibosheth, the boy who was made a cripple at the age of 5. His nurse picked him up and was fleeing from an opposing army, and she dropped him, and he became crippled in both feet. For his love of Jonathan and his covenant with Jonathan, he's not going to let the Gibeonites have Jonathan's son. But there are other people in Saul's family that he's going to cough up. 5 are going to be the sons of Merab. Merab was Saul's oldest daughter. She was the one that Saul had initially promised to let David marry. But then Saul had pulled a switcheroo and married Merab off to another man. And then Saul sought to trick David into marrying Michal for the price of, you kill 100 of my enemies, the Philistines, and bring me their foreskins, thinking that the Philistines will surely kill David. And David brought back twice the bride price. But Merab was the girl who was supposed to have been given to David. But Saul had married her off to somebody else. And she and her husband had 5 sons who are now grown men. And so David's going to give Merab's 5 sons. But the people of Gibeon had asked for 7. So he's got to find 2 more. Saul, in addition to his wives, had taken some concubines, and one of those concubines was a girl named Rizpah. She's our heroine of the story. She bore him 2 children. David, acting as king, trying to atone for what Saul did to the Gibeonites, has agreed to the Gibeonites' terms, and he's taken 7 innocent people. Their only crime is they happen to be related by blood to Saul. Merab's sons are Saul's grandsons, and his concubine, Rizpah, has produced for him 2 sons. And David is going to cough up those 7 men, and the Gibeonites are going to take them, and they're going to publicly execute them. And then they're going to hang their bodies on trees out in the open, not allowing them to have an honorable burial. That's where Rizpah comes in. The Gibeonites demanded this in the springtime. It would have been like March, April, the very beginning of the spring, the time when they should be having the spring rains to signal that the famine was over. She is going to put on sackcloth because she's in mourning. She has lost 2 of her sons, and she has also, by extension, lost the other 5 boys who are connected to the house of Saul. She's going to move out of her home, camp out, day in and day out, sleep there at night for 6 months until the fall of the year, September, October. And every single day, as she is staying by the place where her sons and her other relatives have been put to death and their bodies are not allowed to be buried, she's going to keep the scavenger birds and other predators from coming and getting the carcasses. After just 1 or 2 days, the bodies would start to decay. It would smell bad. It's one of the reasons why you don't hear this story talked about very much from pulpits or in Sunday school classes, is because it's a pretty gruesome thing. But bear in mind, this woman is grieving the loss of her family, and she can't stop the king, in this case David, from turning over her family to the enemy, knowing that they're going to be tortured and put to death. She can't stop the enemy from doing a wicked thing by having these innocent people put to death. All she can do to show love for them and to grieve over them is to protect their bodies from being torn to shreds, picked apart bit by bit as though they were roadkill. And she'll stay there day after day after day for 6 months, from the spring until the fall harvest time. Word will reach David what Rizpah has done. David will then issue the order to allow what remains of those bodies to be taken off and given honorable burial. The interesting things to note there are that even though this was not the information age, but it was still in David's kingdom, she stayed out there day after day after day, night after night, for 6 months, grieving, but also doing everything she could to fight off predators that would have had claws, and possibly some of the other wild animals she might have had to throw rocks at, risking her own life and health, and frankly her emotional state, as the bodies continued to decay. She couldn't stop the death from happening. She couldn't stop the decay, but she could keep the bodies from being dishonored any further. And when David hears about it, he finally allows for the burial to take place. And it is only after Rizpah has done that for 6 months and the bodies have been buried that the famine ceases. David probably should have sought God's advice and said, God, what do I do to make amends? And when the Gibeonites came back with this request, he could have asked God, is this really what you want done? Or he could have set limits on the Gibeonites, because remember, the Gibeonites are servants of David. He could have said, yes, you may take these men and execute them, but you must not allow their bodies to be dishonored and desecrated by preventing a burial. David didn't do that. Rizpah is a heroine, because she is showing love even through deep, deep grief to do the right thing. And ultimately, the king is ashamed of his own self because he didn't find out about it sooner, and he didn't take steps to see to it that the men had an honorable burial sooner. Drop down to verse 10 through 14, the very end of that passage in 2 Samuel 21. And Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock. From the beginning of the harvest until it rained on them from the sky, and she allowed neither the birds of the sky to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field at night. She was on guard duty all the time. When it was told David what Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, the concubine of Saul, had done, then David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the open square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged them on the day the Philistines struck down Saul in Gilboa. He brought up the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from there, and they gathered the bones of those who had been hanged. David's going to get Rizpah's sons, Merab's sons, and finally the bones of Saul and Jonathan to see to it that they all get an honorable burial. They buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son in the country of Benjamin in Zelah, in the grave of Kish his father. They did all that the king commanded. And after that, God was moved by prayer for the land. David had delayed in doing the right thing. Justice delayed is justice denied. David was finally shamed into taking proper action when he heard about this woman's undying devotion to at least care for the bodies of her sons and the other people. Sometimes you may be just a nobody in the eyes of the world. Rizpah was considered a nobody. She's a concubine. She's a second-class wife. She's already suffered the loss of Saul. Now she's suffered the loss of her sons. But even in her grief, she wasn't going to let evil continue unchecked. She stayed by those boys' bodies' sides until David was compelled by hearing of her courage to take action to give a proper burial. It's not a very pleasant story to hear. Even if you haven't lost a loved one, it's not a pleasant story to hear. But it speaks a lot to the character of this woman, that she didn't just crawl off somewhere and get bitter and be angry at the Gibeonites and angry at David and angry at the world. She found something she could do to show love in the only way that was left to her for her departed loved ones. And by her example of staying at that task, no matter what the weather conditions, no matter whether the wild beasts were strong animals that could have easily overpowered and harmed or killed her, she was going to stay there as long as it took to take care of her sons' bodies. She was a covenant keeper. Thanks for watching.